Welcome to Save Us from Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I am your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm a journalist who covers the United Nations and editor-in-chief of UN Dispatch.
And I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an author and an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York. I read and write and teach about the UN.
So, Anjali, in our debut segment, we discussed how Martin Griffiths, who was the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the Emergency Relief Coordinator, these are two titles under the same person, was leaving his post at the end of June. It is now mid-July, and there is still no replacement for Martin Griffiths. Like, what do you think's happening?
I don't know because it's such a not transparent process. We actually don't know who's, in consideration. We don't know when that selection might happen. What we do know is that even, the UN spokesperson who briefed a couple of days ago said that we would know when he knew, right? So it's a big mystery. And the other thing we do know is that the need for someone to fill this position hasn't receded at all. And we saw that yesterday at the Security Council when Joyce Masuya, the acting Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and acting Emergency Relief Coordinator, as of the 1st of July, had to brief the Security Council in lieu of a permanent person in that position.
Yeah, she is a Tanzanian who's had a long career in the UN system, and she was the deputy to Martin Griffiths, now is the acting Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. And she briefed the Security Council on Tuesday, July 9th, in an emergency session convened to address a barrage of Russian missile strikes on civilian targets throughout Ukraine, including a really tragic attack on a children's hospital in Ukraine, and that destroyed Ukraine's only pediatric cancer ward.
Let me remind this council that hospitals have special protection under international humanitarian law. Intentionally directing attacks against a protected hospital is a war crime, and perpetrators must be held to account.
There are these really horrific images of, children receiving chemotherapy on the side of the street instead of in a medical facility, all because Russia destroyed this hospital, this ward, in a missile attack.
And against the backdrop of that situation, right, as you were saying, we saw this emergency meeting at the UN Security Council being called. And we had this sort of classic UN situation where an almost farcical attention to the sort of extremely specific rules and procedures of the Security Council started out dominating a debate about something that is truly a human horror and a human tragedy, right?
Yeah. So, to remind listeners, Russia is the president of the Security Council for the month of July. We discussed this a bit last week. And, as president of the Security Council, they have the responsibility to, organize and chair meetings of the Security Council and, kind of run the rules of procedure of the Security Council. Now, there is a rule known as Rule 37 of the Rules of Procedure. This is getting, not terribly technical, but basically it says that if you are a member state of the United Nations and the Security Council is discussing something that pertains to you, maybe it happened on your territory, in some way it involves your country, you have the right to attend that Security Council meeting and speak at that Security Council meeting. Now, you can't vote, you're not a member of the Security Council, but you can attend and you can speak your piece at that meeting. Now, things got a little wonky and complicated because of the fact that this attack occurred on Ukrainian territory. Russia launched the attack. Russia is also president of the Security Council. So sparks or procedural sparks flew between the Ukrainian representative to the United Nations and the Russian ambassador to the United Nations.
Yeah, so essentially, Russia opens the meeting of the Security Council as the president of the Security Council. It's their job to run the logistics of the meeting. But the key sort of sticking point at the opening of the meeting was that Ukraine's request to be sat at this meeting didn't go through the normal procedures. Instead, Ukraine sent a letter to the Secretariat. On Twitter, they CC'd a bunch of other missions to the UN, but not the Russian mission to the UN, right? And Russia's point was that this is not the way this kind of thing is done. Um, the Russian ambassador to the UN made a very sharp point about the sort of formality of the position. He said that the presidency is an institution, it's not a country, and therefore Ukraine should not disregard the sort of rules and procedures of the Security Council. It should have sent a letter to the Security Council as was standard to ask to be seated. Now, this is the kind of thing where you know um, the Ukrainian rejoinder was uh, pretty forceful.
Yeah, so basically, like the Russian ambassador took umbrage with the fact that
Hmm.
Ukraine wouldn't send Russia, acting as
Hmm.
president of the Security Council, a letter requesting their attendance because because the Ukrainian ambassador absolutely despises, for legitimate reasons, the government of Russia. So instead, on Twitter, the Ukrainian ambassador said this. He goes, and so the Russian ambassador is Ambassador Nebenzia. He doesn't call him Ambassador Nebenzia. He won't give him that formality. He goes, Citizen Nebenzia, you are not a legitimate president of the Security Council, and I will never address you as one. You are sitting on the seat that Russia invaded illegally, and the only proper seat for you before you end up in hell, bypassing purgatory, is in the dock. As for Rule 37 of the Rules of Procedure, then he kind of copies and pastes the Rules 37. But it was a tense moment.
I just want to flag the end of that tweet, which goes full Joe Biden, because he says it's impossible to stomach malarkey from Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, like this one. Direct quote, he says. And then he says certain UN members to replace international law and the UN Charter with some rules based international order. These mysterious rules have never been the subject of transparent international consultations, nor have been they laid out for everyone's attention. Um, so much about the rules and procedures by the invader of a UN permanent seat and never the president, surely a prisoner one day, right? So, this is essentially literally go straight to hell, do not pass purgatory, do not collect $200. And, your rules, they mean nothing in a world
Mhm,
where you are breaking actual international law left and right.
mhm. So I mean, this was. I mean, there's like a degree of like bemusement about this
Hmm.
for UN watchers, but as you
Right.
noted, it's like a very serious issue that they
Yeah.
were intended to discuss, like attacks on civilian targets
Yeah.
throughout Ukraine. But what do you make of this, Anjali? Because we've seen since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, scenes
Yeah.
like this play out at the Security Council,
Yeah.
where the Ukrainian ambassador, who is very articulate, rarely reads
Mhm.
from notes, looks
Yeah,
directly at his adversary while addressing him.
yeah,
Um, hurl invectives, justifiably so, in my
yeah,
opinion, but also in doing so seek to rally the rest of the Security Council to his cause, and frankly has been fairly effective at doing
yeah.
so since Russia's invasion.
Yeah, that's right. Ukraine's part of Ukraine's defense following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine has been a full court international law effort, an international institution effort to rally other countries to their cause, right? And to note that, the invasion of a sovereign country is of concern to every member of the international community. We talked a little bit last week about the responsibility to protect and how murky that sort of body of obligations and law is. There's nothing murky about the body of obligations and laws that Ukrainians can rally in their own defense against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right?
Hmm.
It's crystal clear, and they have pointed out masterfully in many cases that this is like the obligation of every state to acknowledge that Russia is an illegitimate actor on many fronts, right? And to acknowledge the sort of um, how far over the line of acceptable international behavior Russia has been. The one sort of strange point in their defense and their sort of full court efforts to recruit other countries to their cause has been their repeated insistence that Russia is the illegitimate holder of a permanent seat at the UN Security Council.
Yeah, explain the history of that because this is something that the Ukrainians kind of test drove a lot in
Yeah.
the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, suggesting that the Russian government, as it exists now, ought not to have adopted or taken over what was the Soviet seat before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Um, like how have they argued that point?
Yeah, they've essentially argued that that Soviet seat, there was no necessary reason it should go to Russia, right? That
Like, why
there
not
were
Latvia
right, exactly, right? Why not Estonia,
or
right?
Ukraine?
Well, not Ukraine, right? Because
Yeah,
Ukraine was a founding member of
right.
the UN. So it couldn't have been Ukraine, but it could have been, in theory, according to them, any other
Mhm,
former Soviet state, right? No
mm.
reason it should have to default to Russia. Unfortunately, that is not an argument that has a lot of legs under international law. The one key example that we have, which Courtney Fung told us a little bit about a couple of weeks ago when we interviewed her, it is the case that today the People's Republic of China occupies a seat that was once held by Taiwan. That is a different set of procedures and understandings than what happened at the sort of collapse of the Soviet Union, in part because we don't always think of it this way, but Russia is sort of what is left after every other state secedes from the Soviet Union.
Mhm.
Right? Every other state declares its independence from the Soviet Union, and Russia is the holder of the Soviet seat because it is the rump state left standing, right?
Mm.
But also the moment to contest that changeover would have been then, right?
Yes.
Because at this moment, right, Russia inherits all of the obligations, all of the legal obligations, all of the arms control treaties, all of the sort of binding apparatus of permanent membership at the end of the Cold War. And there's really, at this point, no way to contest that without upending all of those
Yeah.
international arrangements.
Yeah, I mean, to me, Ukraine's insistence on this point is really one of their only missteps at
Mhm.
the Security Council, at the UN in general, since Russia's invasion. I mean, there's no need to kind of go down that road. It's sort of
Mhm.
distracting to the overall point that
Mhm.
one member state can't just invade another in a land grab.
Right. That said, you can understand where this argument about illegitimacy comes from, right? Because, this chamber really sets in high relief the sort of desperation of people living under threat of violence and the sort of high manicured nature of politics at the UN. There's this funny trade off between Russia sitting in its role as the president with this heavy insistence on rules, saying the presidency is an institution, not a country, saying Ukraine should have submitted a letter to the Security Council and saying that the only reason they're allowing Ukraine to attend this meeting is at the insistence of the US, right? Essentially saying it's a shame Ukraine can't do anything without its patrons to follow the rules for it, right? And the sort of contrast between all of that high politics and the sort of heavy insistence once it starts briefing the meeting as Russia and not the presidency of the Security Council that obviously what else but clearly Ukraine hit its own children's hospital,
Yes.
right? And so that contrast between the insistence on the rules of the procedure of the Security Council and the absolute lawlessness of its sort of actions in Ukraine and the absolute sort of willingness to say what you see is not what you see is, it's a real contrast. It's a real sort of it shows you why I think Ukraine might pull on this thread and say, how can this be legitimate?
Russia is like a stickler for rules of procedure, but not grander rules of international law. Namely, like the golden rule of international law, don't invade your neighbor and take their land.
Don't bomb hospitals, don't bomb children's hospitals, right? Like these are all cardinal principles of international law and international humanitarian law. It's a very clear, gross violation of international humanitarian law to be bombing hospitals, right? But, you know, being a stickler for rules, again, shows us something about the importance that Russia accords to the Security Council
Mm.
chamber and framework. And I would bet that for a lot of members of the Security Council, it is better for Russia to believe itself to be bound by these laws than to not be bound by these laws. Because that's a space. It's a space to push it. It may not ever do anything, right? But the alternative is that Russia doesn't believe it's bound by these laws. The alternative isn't that by doing something at the Security Council, they can make Russia stop bombing hospitals. And you really see like a funny example of this at the end of the meeting when after Ukraine's ambassador to the UN, you know, has this masterful speech and really sort of lays his case before the other members. The Russian ambassador to the UN says, in my capacity as the president, I am compelled to thank the Russian, excuse me, I am compelled to thank the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN. And that's like, you
Yeah.
know, the guy thinks you got to hold on to the rules of the chamber for some reason.
Yes.
It's not at all funny, but it is funny in the sense that, like, there's something so comic about the contrast between these things. And in part because the situation is so dire that all of these insistences on these small little procedures become like, what are you doing, man?
Yeah. Well, as co-host of To Save Us
Mhm.
from Hell, Anjali, I am compelled to thank you for your insights and insist that we move on to the next segment, in which I'll be doing more talking and you'll be
Yeah,
doing more asking of questions.
100%.